Two American Special Forces soldiers vanished into the jungles of Vietnam in 1965. No bodies were ever found, but what they left behind changed the course of the war. On the morning of July 13, 1965, a tense silence hung over the highlands of South Vietnam. Master Sergeant Henry J. Gallant and Sergeant First Class Fred Taylor, two seasoned American Special Forces advisors, led a covert long-range reconnaissance patrol. Their mission was simple yet deadly: scout enemy activity north of Highway 19, a vital supply route. As part of the elite Project Delta, with them were 8 South Vietnamese soldiers, their lives intertwined in the dense, unforgiving jungle, moving silently through the southern slopes of a remote mountain, 40 miles southwest of Canton. The team was suddenly engulfed in a hail of gunfire. The ambush was brutal and instantaneous. In the chaos, the patrol broke apart. Taylor, with a voice tight with urgency, called in an emergency extraction request over his radio. Then, a sickening moment, Gallant was hit, a gunshot to his stomach. His condition was unknown, his face a mask of pain. Taylor, a man defined by loyalty, refused to abandon his friend. As the enemy closed in, the last anyone saw of the two Americans was Taylor, helping his wounded comrade. Deeper into the thick foliage, swallowed by the jungle's emerald canopy, a desperate rescue operation was immediately launched. Aircraft buzzed low over the terrain, and ground teams combed through every shadow. 5 of the Vietnamese team members were eventually recovered, but there was no sign of Gallant, Taylor, or the remaining 3. They were never seen again. The dense foliage swallowed them whole. Sergeant First Class Fred Taylor, his lungs burning, dragged Master Sergeant Henry J. Gallant through a wall of vines and thick undergrowth. The sounds of the ambush faded behind them, replaced by the relentless hum of insects and the drip of moisture from the canopy above. Taylor's hands were slick with blood, not his own, but Gallant's. Just a little farther, Henry Taylor gasped, his voice a low grunt. Gallant, his face pale and clammy, gritted his teeth against the searing pain in his stomach. The gunshot wound had left a dark, widening stain on his uniform. Each step was a brutal test of will. They found a small, rocky crevice hidden by a cascade of ferns. It was too small for a man to stand in, but it was just enough to hide. Taylor eased Gallant down, his own body trembling from the exertion. He tore a strip from his shirt and pressed it against the wound. A temporary, useless effort against the bleeding. The immediate threat of the ambush was gone, but a new, more terrifying reality had set in. They were 2 men, one gravely wounded, lost in a jungle that was both their sanctuary and their tomb. As Taylor knelt, the distant snap of a twig shattered the momentary silence. He froze, his hand instinctively going for his M16. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too heavy. The enemy was sweeping the area, searching. They were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. Gallant's eyes fluttered open. "Go, Fred," he whispered, the words choked with pain. "Leave me. You can make it. You have to." Taylor shook his head, his jaw set in a hard line. "Don't be a fool, Henry. We're in this together." But the sounds of the search party were growing closer, and Taylor knew they had precious little time. He could try to move Gallant, but the movement could kill him. He could stay and fight, but that would be a suicide mission. The jungle held their lives in the balance, and their only option was to disappear completely. As the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, Taylor made a split-second decision. He looked at Gallant, then back out at the jungle, an impossible plan forming in his mind. With the sound of approaching boots growing louder, Taylor acted without hesitation. He pulled Gallant's dog tags from his neck and quickly wrapped them around a large, jagged rock. He then ripped another strip from his uniform and soaked it in his friend's blood, letting it drip onto the rock and the ground beneath it. He smeared the blood across some low-hanging leaves, creating a convincing trail that led away from their hiding spot and further up the slope. "Stay," Taylor whispered, his voice as hard as a command. "No matter what you hear, no matter what you feel, don't make a sound." Gallant, his eyes half closed from the pain, gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Taylor then slipped away from the crevice, moving with the preternatural silence of a man who had lived in the jungle for years. He deliberately snapped a twig here, rustled a few leaves there, and trampled a patch of tall grass all, leading in the direction of his false trail. He found cover behind a thick banyan tree and watched as the enemy soldiers, their rifles held ready, passed within 10 feet of the crevice where Gallant lay. They stopped, their eyes scanning the dense foliage. Taylor held his breath, every muscle in his body rigid with tension. Then, one of the soldiers pointed to the blood-smeared rock and the trail of broken leaves. They exchanged a few quick words in their own language, and without a second thought, they followed the decoy. Their footsteps faded, drawn by the lie Taylor had created. When the jungle's quiet returned, Taylor crept back to Gallant. The older soldier was still, his face ashen, his breathing shallow. The temporary victory felt hollow. They had escaped the immediate threat, but they were no better off than they had been before. They were now 2 men, one bleeding internally, isolated and lost. The real fight for survival had just begun. Gallant needed immediate medical attention that Taylor could not provide. They couldn't stay here, but where could they go? Taylor's mind raced, a whirlwind of calculated risks and desperate hope. Gallant's skin was cold and clammy, a telltale sign of shock. He was in no condition to walk, and every minute they stayed in this crevice was another minute closer to being discovered, or for Gallant's life to simply ebb away. The only option was a gamble. They had to move. "We're going to a village," Taylor said, his voice low and firm. "About 3 clicks north. I saw it on the ops map. A Montagnard settlement. They might be able to help." Using his field knife, Taylor cut a section of his uniform, folding it into a makeshift compress and cinching it tightly around Gallant's wound with a length of paracord. The crude bandage was far from a solution, but it was all he had. With grim determination, he fashioned a simple sling, using the vines and a tough branch to support Gallant's weight. He helped his friend to his feet, letting Gallant lean heavily on him as they began their agonizingly slow trek. Every step was a battle. The jungle seemed to fight against them. The dense undergrowth tore at their clothes and skin, and the humid air was suffocating. Gallant's ragged breaths were the only sound louder than their heavy footsteps. Taylor felt a crushing burden of responsibility with every grunt of pain from his friend. He pushed on, his focus narrowed to the single goal, reaching that village. They had been moving for what felt like an eternity when they finally reached a clearing. It wasn't a village, but a sheer, unscalable cliff face, hundreds of feet high, blocking their path. Below them, a deep, wide river churned and twisted, its swift current a dangerous, impassable barrier. They were trapped between the roaring water and the insurmountable rock, and behind them, the jungle was silent, waiting. They couldn't go back. There was no way to go forward. The despair was a physical weight, heavier than the oppressive humidity. Taylor stared at the sheer rock face that seemed to mock their exhaustion. He glanced down at the churning, white-capped river below. The cliff was impassable, the river an instant death sentence. Gallant's breathing was becoming more shallow, and his color was a sickly gray. They were at a dead end, but a special forces soldier is trained to see what others miss. Taylor's eyes, trained to find the most inconspicuous path, scanned the wall of rock. He noticed a faint, almost invisible crack running horizontally along the cliff, about 10 feet up. It wasn't a ledge, but a series of small footholds and handholds, overgrown with moss and ferns, a hidden goat path, a route known only to those who lived and died in this unforgiving landscape. It was a terrifying gamble. One slip would send them plunging into the river below. "Hold on, Henry," Taylor grunted, helping his friend sit up. He found a sturdy, tangled root jutting from the cliff and used it as a support, hoisting Gallant up onto his shoulder. With his wounded friend's weight a crushing burden, he began the perilous traverse. He stretched his arm as far as it could reach, his fingers finding purchase in the jagged cracks. His feet slid along the treacherous, wet stone. Below, the river roared, a constant, deafening reminder of their fragile existence. They moved inch by agonizing inch, a slow, high-stakes dance with death. The pain from Gallant's wound was a silent scream, but he clung to Taylor with a grip that spoke of a will to survive. Just as they were halfway across, the path narrowing to a whisper, a sound from the opposite bank cut through the roar of the river. Taylor paused, his heart pounding in his ears. Through the misty rain and the thick tree line on the far side, he saw a flickering glow, small but distinct, the orange light of a campfire. He squinted, his mind racing. It could be a friendly patrol, an indigenous village, or ... Then, a shadowy figure moved in front of the fire, the unmistakable silhouette of a rifle over its shoulder. It wasn't one of them. It was the enemy. They were completely exposed, pinned between the treacherous path, the unforgiving river, and a new, unknown threat on the other side. The sight of the enemy campfire was a punch to the gut. Taylor's heart hammered against his ribs. He froze, pressing himself and Gallant as flat against the rock as possible. The cold stone a shocking contrast to the feverish heat of Gallant's skin. They were completely exposed, a perfect silhouette against the dark cliff face. One glance from the figures on the far bank, and they were dead. The figure by the fire moved again, its form silhouetted by the flickering light. They were setting up camp for the night. The thought sent a jolt of cold dread through Taylor. They could not stay on this ledge. The path was too precarious, and the risk of being discovered was too high. They had to get off the cliff. Taylor's eyes searched the rock face below them, looking for any possible route down. He spotted it, a fissure in the cliff that ran diagonally, a jagged, broken line that ended at the water's edge. It was a terrifying route, more of a controlled fall than a descent, but it was their only way off the ledge without being seen. "Hold on, Henry," Taylor whispered, his voice strained with resolve. With a superhuman effort, he began the perilous journey downward, using his back and feet to brace against the jagged walls of the fissure. Gallant moaned softly, each jolt a fresh wave of agony. They slid, scraped, and fell, their bodies battered by the unforgiving rock. Finally, exhausted and trembling, they landed on the riverbank, hidden from view by a cluster of large, waterlogged rocks. The roar of the river was deafening here. It was a perfect cover, masking their ragged breathing and the soft rustle of their movements. Taylor crawled to the water's edge, scooping the cool water into his hands to drink, then used it to clean Gallant's blood-soaked shirt. As he worked, his gaze swept the opposite bank, now a blur in the gathering gloom. But something by the enemy campfire caught his eye. A small, crude bamboo raft, tied to the shore, sat half submerged in the water. It was a fragile, barely seaworthy vessel, but it represented a chance, a desperate, terrifying gamble that might be their only way out of this valley of death. The enemy could be planning to use it in the morning to cross. They were no longer trapped by the cliff. Now they were trapped by a river, and the enemy waiting on the other side. Taylor knew they couldn't wait. He looked at Gallant, his face a ghostly white in the darkness. Waiting for morning was a death sentence. The enemy would be alert, and Gallant might not survive the night. A desperate gamble was their only option. "We're crossing now, Henry," Taylor whispered, his voice firm. "We're going to steal that raft." He stripped out of his uniform, leaving him in just his boots and undershirt. He secured Gallant's dog tags and personal effects in a waterproof pouch and tied it to a vine around his neck. Using the vine as a makeshift anchor, he secured Gallant to himself, ensuring the wounded man would stay afloat. The freezing water of the river was a shock, its strong current pulling at them. Taylor battled against it, swimming with a one-armed, powerful stroke while using the other to keep Gallant's head above the surface. The roar of the water was a perfect mask for their struggle, and the shadows of the night protected them from the firelight on the opposite bank. They moved like ghosts in the churning current, their progress slow and agonizing. Each stroke was a battle against exhaustion and fear. Finally, their feet hit the muddy bank. They collapsed, shivering and gasping, their muscles screaming in protest. Taylor, now a silent predator, crept towards the fire. The enemy soldiers were asleep, their rifles propped against a tree, their fire a beacon in the darkness. The small, crude bamboo raft lay a few feet away, its mooring rope tied to a thick rope. Taylor cut the rope with his knife, his heart pounding in his chest. As he turned to pull the raft towards them, he noticed something in a burlap sack tied to the raft. It wasn't just supplies. He opened it carefully and felt a stack of papers and a small, leather-bound book. He couldn't read the language, but one image stood out in the book. It was a crude, hand-drawn map. It didn't show the valley they were in. It showed a series of hidden, fortified tunnels and bunkers far to the south, marked with dates and locations of planned attacks. They had found more than a raft. They had stumbled upon a high-value intelligence asset, a secret far bigger than their own desperate flight. The escape was no longer just about survival. It was about getting this information back to their command. Their mission had just changed. With the intelligence in hand, Taylor's focus narrowed. The mission had changed. Their survival was no longer just about their lives. It was about getting this map and documents to command. He carefully secured the burlap sack, placing it between his chest and Gallant's back as they lay on the makeshift raft. The river, once a terrifying barrier, was now their only path forward. Taylor used his hands and a broken branch to paddle, steering the crude raft downstream, away from the enemy's campfire. The moonless night made navigation impossible, but the strong current was on their side, pulling them silently deeper into the jungle. Gallant was fading fast, his body cold and still, his breathing shallow. Taylor kept up a constant stream of low, encouraging words, a desperate prayer against the silence of the jungle. As dawn broke, a thick fog settled over the river. It was a mixed blessing, hiding them from the enemy but also obscuring their view. Taylor pushed the raft through the mist, his eyes straining to recognize anything from the stolen map. After what felt like an eternity, the fog began to thin. Through the clearing mist, Taylor saw a familiar formation of rock and tree. He recognized it from their intelligence briefings. It was a primary rendezvous point, codenamed Eagle's Perch, a site used by covert reconnaissance teams. He paddled with renewed vigor, maneuvering the raft toward the riverbank. They landed the raft on a small, muddy bank. Taylor helped Gallant onto the shore and collapsed beside him, his body screaming for rest. As he lay there, his eyes swept over the area. It was a textbook rendezvous point, but it felt empty. The thought of being so close, yet still alone, was a crushing blow. But then he saw it. Tucked into the hollow of a tree, half hidden by a bush, was a small, nylon backpack. It was American, and it looked recent. He crawled towards it and found a satellite radio and a sealed note. The note was dated from just a few hours prior. The radio was their lifeline, their way to get the critical intelligence back to command. Taylor made his final choice. He looked at Gallant, whose breathing was now a shallow, ragged whisper. They couldn't wait. The intel was too valuable, and his friend was fading. He had to risk it all for one last, desperate attempt at salvation. He set up the satellite radio, its plastic shell cool in his trembling hands. The power light glowed, a fragile beacon of hope. With a heavy breath, he keyed the microphone. "This is Detachment B-52, Project Delta, codename Eagle 1, he said, his voice low and urgent. "On the ground, Eagle's Perch, we have high-value intelligence. Request immediate extraction. I say again, immediate extraction, over." There was no response, just the static of a distant channel. Taylor's heart sank. He tried again. "This is Eagle 1. Location, grid reference Alpha 37. We have a high-value asset. Documents from a downed enemy patrol. Request immediate sitrep and extraction. We are compromised. I say again, we are compromised, over." Silence. Then, a faint voice crackled through the static. "Eagle 1, we copy. Sit tight. Extraction is inbound. Hold the line, over." A wave of relief washed over him, but it was cut short by the realization of his final, inevitable mistake. The transmission, brief as it was, had given away their position. A silent beat passed, then a distant crackle of gunfire echoed through the jungle. It wasn't close, but it was getting closer. They were no longer hidden. They had been found. Taylor carefully turned off the radio and placed it back in the pack. He looked at Gallant, a faint smile on his lips. They had done it. The information was out. The mission was a success. He helped his friend to his feet and began to move again, not away from the sound of the gunfire, but towards it. The intelligence transmitted from Eagle's Perch proved to be a turning point. It provided crucial information that led to the discovery of a network of fortified tunnels and bunkers, disrupting a major planned offensive and saving countless American and South Vietnamese lives. The information was vital, but its source remained a mystery. No one ever heard from Henry J. Gallant or Fred Taylor again. Their names were added to the list of the missing in action. They were never found, their final moments lost to the dense foliage of a silent war. But the intel they provided, the final act of two professional soldiers who gave everything and asked for nothing, ensured their courage and sacrifice would never truly be forgotten. They had vanished, but their legacy endured.